Hi there, and welcome to the Everyday Millionaire Podcast. My name is Patrick Francie, and I'm the CEO of the Real Estate Investment Network. In addition to being a business owner, I'm also a real estate investor, I'm a coach, I'm a husband, I'm a very proud grandfather. And along with that, I'm also committed to stretching beyond what I've already achieved and of living a fulfilled life by continuing to make a positive difference in the world. I invite you to join me to listen in on the Everyday Millionaire Podcast as I interview and have conversations with seemingly ordinary individuals who have achieved some pretty extraordinary results, whether it be in their life, in their business, in real estate. And it's here where I'm going to delve into the details of their journey, along with the paths they've traveled to get where they are today, and as importantly, where they intend to go in the future. My guests are here to inspire. They're here to help you learn by talking about what's real for them, both in their wins and in their challenges, from the life and the lifestyle they live to the person they had to become along the way in creating and building their financial futures for themselves and their families. Before I begin this episode, I'll start by first thanking you for listening in and for your support and the feedback you provide us on the show, as well as to ask you to please continue to send your comments, your suggestions, or your questions directly to me at ceo@reincanada.com. That is ceo@reincanada.com. And if you're inclined, please share this podcast with your friends or your family and with people you know, or perhaps even people you don't know. Rate the show and comment on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or whatever platform you happen to use to listen in. And while you're at it, please follow me on the Everyday Millionaire Facebook page. So thanks again for the feedback you provide us. It's definitely appreciated. Okay, let's get on with this show and have a conversation with today's guest. My guest in today's episode, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young, is an entrepreneur, an educator, a leader in helping students overcome learning difficulties, and the author of her best-selling book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. Some have said that Barbara's story is truly heroic, even on par with the achievements of Helen Keller. Barbara Arrowsmith is the founder of the Arrowsmith program, which is an assessment process and a suite of cognitive exercises designed to stimulate and strengthen weak areas of cognitive functioning that underlie a range of learning difficulties. The genesis of the Arrowsmith program was cognitive exercises, which lies in Barbara's own journey of discovery and innovation to overcome her own severe learning disabilities. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. Back in grade 1, she was diagnosed as having a mental block, which today would have been identified as multiple learning disabilities. She read and wrote everything backwards. She had trouble processing concepts in language, continuously got lost, and was physically uncoordinated. Barbara eventually learned to read and write from left to right and mask a number of the symptoms of her learning disabilities through very heroic effort on her part. However, she continued throughout her educational career to have difficulty with very specific aspects of learning. Forge ahead many years later, and the Arrowsmith program has been delivered for over 40 plus years throughout the world and continues to expand and grow to change students' lives in the most profound ways. On this episode, she'll share her incredibly fascinating journey of learning challenges that led to a global program for thousands with similar challenges around the world. Let's get this show started. Barbara Arrowsmith-Young, welcome to the Everyday Millionaire Podcast. Incredibly excited to have you on the show.
I'm really excited to be here.
Man, we got lots of things to talk about. And, Barbara, you're a best-selling author. You're the founder of your program in schools, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. You're best-selling author of the book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. That's so interesting.
I once had somebody at a bookstore ask me, is there a book on the man who changed his brain? I said, actually, it applies whether you're a male or a female, but it was just an interesting question.
Probably wishful thinking, maybe, hey? So Barbara, let's, in all of that, I mean, you've got big accolades, you got just a great bio, but tell me, for our listeners, Who is Barbara Arrowsmith-Young? What are you all about? Talk to me about changing brain, and let's get into this conversation. But tell me a little bit about just who you are and what are you doing today? Because we'll go
Yeah.
backwards.
Okay. So I guess I think I'm all about transformation and service. I was thinking earlier today, I grew up in a family where, when we said grace around the table, it was, how can we be of service, to others, to the world? How can we make the world a better place? So to me, that was a touchstone. And then, having a father who was an inventor and a scientist who, saw possibilities where there weren't things in existence currently, I think those two things really shaped me, and that is where I am today, being of service to individuals that are struggling with learning difficulties as I did, and transforming futures in essence through the application of the principles of neuroplasticity to stimulate cognitive function to change individuals' brains so they can learn more efficiently, more effectively, with ease and joy. And, where learning, instead of becoming a struggle, actually becomes an adventure. So I think, where I came from shaped, who I am and what I'm doing today.
You use the term learning difficulties. You don't use the term learning disability, which I don't know if I'm picking up on something, but there's some intentionality there, I believe. Is that the case?
Yes, very definitely. I mean, it's interesting. In North America, we use the term learning disability. That's the term to describe, the kinds of difficulties I had, the difficulties that students, that come to my work have. And it was really when I was in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, they use the term learning difficulty. Mm-hmm. And so I started to really change my language because it is a difficulty. I mean, there's some people that talk about a learning difference, and yes, it is a difference, but there is a difficulty. So to me, learning difference, I think, oversimplifies the challenges, because my experience was, yes, I had differences, but they created significant difficulties. I don't like the term disability because there's all sorts of implications around that. I mean, it's a difficulty, it's a challenge, which leads to making certain aspects of learning difficult. So we're working to change that language in our writing. The challenge is we still have to reference learning disability because that's what people in North America are used to and thinking about. But we're wanting to move that conversation to look at is the difficulty. And if we think about anybody like ourselves, we don't necessarily have to have been diagnosed with a learning disability or learning difficulty, but we all know there's certain things that we avoid because they're challenging or difficult. And that's just probably because there's a cognitive function that isn't sort of up to par, that in certain aspects of learning, it causes some difficulty, so we avoid it. So I think it's a much more accurate terminology.
So let's talk a little bit because, I think we have to get, for listeners, talk about the challenges. Let's talk about the challenges you face, because the book that you wrote and the program that you developed, the school, do we call them schools? I guess we call them schools, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. That you went on to open and move forward in a really, really big way, all stemmed from your own learning challenges growing up.
Yes. So absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't we talk about that? Because, I know there's lots of parents listening to this. I know it's going to be a very interesting topic when we talk about learning difficulties, because there's lots of connotation with kids. Is it a learning difficulty? Is it ADD? Is it too much time on their smartphones and devices? And are they really developing? And is our brain changing because of technology and what kids are doing and how they're learning? They're not reading as much. They're watching video. They're watching sound bites of 2 minutes and 60 seconds. I mean, there's so many things, but let's talk about your journey to developing the program and the book. So let's go back a little ways. And you mentioned your father was a scientist and an inventor.
Yes. So my beginnings, my parents realized that there was something a little off about me even before I got into school. There are 5 children in the family, so I have 4 brothers, 2 older, 2 younger, and so my parents had some other children to compare me to, and I remember my father saying, that it would just take me longer to understand certain things. And he was a mathematician and a physicist. So, things like numbers, but even sequence, cause and effect, as a child, like, why does this happen? What is this kind of behavior going to lead to? But certainly once I got into grade 1, I was identified as having a mental block because this was in the 1950s. And at that time, the term learning disability didn't exist. So the best descriptor that I was given was that I had a mental block. And being quite literal, one of my problems was comprehension and understanding things. And also I was young. I thought I had a piece of wood, like, children's mental block, a block in my head that made learning difficult. And later I came to understand that no, I didn't have a wooden cube in my head, but I had blockages in parts of my brain that made learning challenging. So, in grade 1, I struggled to learn how to read. I struggled to learn how to write. Mathematics, if you gave me 12 and 14, I'd add the 4 and then the 1 and then the 2 and then the 1. I mean, it was just random, because I didn't really understand the concept of numbers and what you did with them. I also struggled with social relations because I didn't really understand meaning. So if somebody spoke to me, I would have to think about what they were saying to try to understand it. I mean, if it was concrete, like it's sunny outside, I could understand that because I could conjure up an image of sun, or if it's raining, I could conjure up an image of rain. But as soon as it became at all abstract or complex, I just absolutely didn't understand it. And I had this image of myself. I had several images. One was, being in a fog, as if there was fog all around me, or surrounded in cotton candy. And I was constantly trying to push through that fog or that cotton candy to try to grasp, what was happening and understand it. But I never could. It always felt like there was a barrier, or I had this image that there was a plate glass window that my face was pressed against. And on the other side, there was a banquet. There were all these people having a wonderful time, but I couldn't engage because that plate glass window was blocking me from being able to participate. So, struggled academically, but also struggled socially. And then I had another learning difficulty that affected knowing where my body was in space. So I was very awkward and clumsy. And that's what my parents picked up also before I started school. So, some students struggle with some of the academics, but maybe they excel in terms of sports. I was the last child ever chosen on any sports team because I was clumsy. I was absolutely no asset to any physical activity. So, I didn't really shine anywhere. And my experience in grade 1, I kind of joke, I became a workaholic. I would come home at lunchtime because my school was across the street, and my mother would have flashcards to teach me how to read and basic numeracy. And then I'd come home after school and she would have flashcards. And I certainly didn't appreciate it at the time. I'm now very grateful because, her persistence meant that I learned how to read and I learned how to write, but it didn't address the underlying learning difficulties. So I really feel like I was given a life sentence in grade 1. My teacher said to my parents, don't have high expectations for your daughter. She's going to struggle all the way through her schooling and, probably not really amount to much. So it was pretty traumatic to hear those words. And certainly she was right in terms of the struggle. I'm hoping she's not right in terms that I didn't amount to much. But yeah, it was a struggle. My schooling was a struggle.
No, I don't want to risk taking it off on a tangent, but a couple things. So, you started to see this in, early elementary school, grade 1, grade 2. Were you aware at the time? How much awareness did you have of your struggles and that you weren't the same as the other kids and that you weren't learning that? And then there's that part of it. And then the next part of it, were you being teased in school? Were you being bullied because of it? Were you being judged by it? And do you have a recollection of how you were feeling at that time? Were you feeling like stupid, or do you have any kind of idea of how you recall of how you were feeling at that point in your life?
Very much so. I mean, stupid was a word that I applied to myself. Bad was a word that I applied to myself. Absolutely, I was aware that I did not learn like the other grade 1 students, because I could look around in my classroom and see, they would open a book and be reading. I would open the book and, would read backwards, upside down, read the words incorrectly. So very, very clear. And they had reading groups at that time that they had the turtles, the rabbits, and the squirrels, right? And clearly I was in the turtle group. And, I don't know, I guess the teacher felt that, people wouldn't really know that that was not the group to be in, but it was obvious. So yes, I knew in grade 1, I actually got the strap. At that time they, gave
martial law.
The strap. Exactly.
Or martial punishment.
In grade 1. And I think, I think it's just my teacher's frustration. I mean, she didn't know how to deal with me. And I would have meltdowns. I was so unhappy. I would spend, significant amount of time in the washroom, because I think my teacher was happy because I just wanted to get out of class because it was so painful. And I just think in a moment of frustration, because I was writing everything backwards, reading backwards. And when I wrote backwards, I'd smear everything because, my hand was sweaty and I was nervous. And she thought I was doing this deliberately. Well, I wasn't clever enough to be doing it deliberately. It was just, to frustrate her. It was just, how I was learning. So certainly right in grade 1, I knew that something was off, something was different. And I came to see myself as not intelligent, and the concept of bad, because somehow I must be bad if I wasn't doing the things that the other students were doing.
Well, and I mean, really, I mean, you've got teachers and people that are surrounding you that don't understand. They've got no education around it. These are things, of course, that back at that time nobody knew, so there's not really compassion for it. You're struggling, so it also, I guess, it makes sense on the social awkwardness or shutting down socially. I mean, if you've got that conversation going in your head, where do you even have the self-esteem to have social interactivity in a kind of a powerful or meaningful way when you don't have a really good view of yourself? And that's even enforced by your teachers. I mean, just as you're describing this scenario, I'm actually having a visceral feeling for you around that, what that must have been like. So you're going through elementary school and you've got this going on. Your parents are understanding of it. But just one question before we go on. I'm interested in knowing, Barbara, often we see and hear stories. I don't want to say often I see, because I don't, but I hear stories and have had experience of, individuals who are challenged in one side of it, but are actually got some amazing gifts on the other side of that, which is, a real kind of ironic place to be, where they've got no skills over here and then are over the top skills on another side. Were you at that time, were you able to identify some of your strengths that were showing up, or were there strengths showing up? I mean, you were physically struggling because you had no sense of where your body was or what it was doing. You've got a mental block that sounds like a wood block in your head. You're really challenged with that. Was there some gifts that were starting to show up?
I think there were some. I'm not sure exactly at what grade I realized. Like, I certainly wasn't aware in the first early grades, sure. But I did, later on recognize that I had a pretty much a photographic visual memory and an auditory verbatim memory. And that got me a long distance, which I'm not sure if that said what that says about the education system. But I think I had strengths there, but I think I overdeveloped them to compensate for my difficulties. So my ritual, probably starting in about grade 6, is I would lay all my notebooks out on my bed to study, and I would cry from the depths of my soul. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was probably putting myself in a Zen state, by draining all the emotion out of my system, because I knew what I was setting out to do was going to be incredibly hard. And then I would basically memorize my notebooks from page 1 right to the end. And my ritual was that I would keep going until I could see the first word on the first page, close my eyes, and I could go through all of my notebooks in my mind's eye visually. So when I then went in to write an exam, I would do a match, right? I would look at that question and I would close my eyes and I would flip through to try to find a match, and then put down that content on the page. And sometimes I did a really good match, so I get 90 or 100%. And sometimes I did a really bad match because I didn't really understand the question, and I might get 10%. And sadly, what my teachers concluded was I hadn't really worked very hard for that 10%. Well, I worked equally hard for the 10 and the 100. It's just I misunderstood the question. And then the verbatim auditory memory, I think I had a strength there, but I developed it. So I would memorize conversations because I didn't really understand them in real time. So, say you and I were having a conversation, I would smile a lot. I would memorize what you were saying. I would walk away and I would play it like a tape recorder over and over and over again. And then I say, I think that's what Patrick meant by that. But you hadn't waited for me for those 2 hours so that I could come back and actually have a conversation with you. And even if you had waited for me, it would be a long and interrupted conversation because then I'd have to memorize the next thing you said, walk away and play it over again. So I really, I think I had those strengths, but I honed them. It got to the point where I could listen to the newscast at 6 o'clock. And if it was the same newscast at 11, I could repeat it word for word ahead of the newscaster. Like not necessarily a great skill.
Yeah, but interesting nonetheless, right? And what a skill to develop, because to that point, how was your recall based on your memory? What did it fade away after days or hours or weeks, or how was your recall for the?
It was I think pretty good. I mean, I didn't remember obviously everything because at a certain point.
Sure, and at some point you're choosing. I don't need to know that anymore, right?
Exactly. I got through that history exam.
Let it go.
The Battle of Hastings in 1066, whatever. Yeah. So, but people that know me comment on my memory, right? And so it is there because I think it always, as I said, was a strength, but I honed it. And we see that with students with learning difficulties is often an area of strength. They will kind of hyper develop that to compensate for the area of difficulty. And then, the other strength that I had, and I didn't understand at the time, but what they talk about executive functioning. Like I was tenacious. Like I didn't understand much, but I kept driving and driving and driving and driving until I would get some sense of what was out there, the material. And I think if I didn't have that capacity, I would never have developed this work because I would have given up. And maybe that was the reasonable thing to do, would be to give up because, to get through university, I used to hide out in the library, like in the washroom in the library. And when the security guards would come around after the library was closed, I would be hiding in the washroom so I could come back and work like overnight. So ultimately, I would spend 20 hours a day, 7 days a week studying just to tread water, and whether that was a good thing. I compromised my immune system as a result. But that was that drive, that driven part of me.
Well, I think you said you have 4 siblings. You're one of 5.
Yes.
So, through that time, even into university, but especially as a young girl growing up, your parents are dealing with 5 kids. That's a handful on any given day. And so then to have one child that's struggling, and not just, it's not like, they may have considered, whatever mental handicap you might have, but you're kind of the oddball out in this. So they've got one child that they're, that is challenged and that they love and want to support, I'm sure. Then you've got 4 siblings. So and then you have this thing called tenacity. Like you've got resilience. You're gonna get this handled. So something was driving you. How was your parents and your family in terms of that growing up? Were they pretty supportive, or were they just like confused, not knowing what the hell to do either?
I would say, that they were supportive in the sense, I never questioned that they didn't love me and they didn't want the best for me. But also it was kind of a time where there wasn't a lot of introspection.
Sure.
There wasn't a lot of understanding, around these kinds of challenges. And also, what I've seen when somebody has a learning difficulty, and I've talked to thousands and thousands of individuals at all ages, and myself included, is we make a pact of silence, believe it or not. Like it's like, because there's still shame associated with having a learning difficulty. Somehow, even if we know it's nothing that we didn't create this, there's that idea of somehow we're less than, right? So we work really hard to cover it up, like to appear, like we're
Normal.
okay. There's this concept called imposter phenomena, right? It's like, so we kind of feel like imposters, but we're really not wanting to let people in because it's like a house of cards. We think if they poke, everything will collapse. And also I hear from students, and I felt this way, is we don't want to burden our parents, right? We don't want to be a burden. We want to look like, we're managing to, work through. So, even like the number of students where I've met the parents and talked to the parents, and then I've met the student, and the students had a very different experience than what the parents think. They've been bullied, they lots of tears, but they don't want to let the parent know. So my wish is that we just have really open conversations and we just dismantle that pact of silence, because there should be no stigma, no shame, to having a learning difficulty. So, my parents, at some level, I think, once I learned how to read and write and the physical manifestations were sort of gone, other than around the mathematics. I used to actually pull my hair out and I used to go down in the basement of the house and bang my head on the dryer. And a few years ago, I actually went back to the house that I grew up in Peterborough, and it was for sale. And that old dryer was down there in the basement with the dents in it for my head.
Oh my God.
If I think I was trying to bang some sense into my head, but my father would try to teach me math from logic and reason and first principles and understanding, which makes sense. But I couldn't do that. And I remember, one of my brothers sharing with me that it was so painful. Like he could not even be in the room when my father was trying to teach me mathematics, right? So I would wait till my father went off on, one of his trips, because he consulted a lot. And then I would memorize the mathematics, right? And then I might do really well. So he thought he had taught me well, right? Well, it was just, he didn't teach me well because I wasn't capable of learning. So it's just all those ways that we kind of hide it because, we don't feel good about ourselves because of the challenges or the difficulties. And still, even today, like the number of times that I hear, oh, he's just lazy, or, she's just not trying hard enough. I had one student that thought her middle name was Can Do Better, right? Because that's all she heard. Deborah can do better. So for years, that's what she thought her middle name was. And the thing is, if you look at a student or an individual and there are areas that they excel in and then other areas that they're avoiding, that's probably an indication that there's a learning difficulty, because we have a desire to master. It's just built into our DNA, like mastery motivation, Maslow's work, like we want to master things. So if somebody's avoiding something, it's usually a pretty good indication that there's something interfering with that kind of learning or that experience, because that's leading to the avoidance. So someone recently said we should have respectful curiosity. I told her I was going to steal that phrase. Like, so be respectfully curious. If somebody's avoiding something, like, let's get interested in why is that, rather than just saying, well, you can do better or try harder.
It's an interesting, Stephanie had, struggled with dyslexia growing up. She was, left-handed. And of course, then they trained her to be right-handed. And she was really, she was quite, she was dyslexic to the point where, she was hiding it. There was shame around that. And I've talked to many people, friends who had dyslexia and are struggling with it even to this day. But there was a time where, there was a lot of shame around being that, because nobody knew. It was, learning disability or not applying yourself, or, you can do better, right? It's like, and it was there was a time where people just didn't understand. I mean, so as I have come to understand a little bit of the work that you're doing, which I want to talk about, you've been actually a real pioneer in kind of working through all of this and what these cognitive challenges are. And so when did let's go back, and before we get to that, but let's go back. So your university, you've got this thing going on. Was there a moment in time where, the light bulb went on, where you saw a tipping point or found a path to go down? When did it start to kind of come together for you?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think that belief that my father instilled in me, which was kind of fermenting in the background, and it was that if there's a problem in the world and currently no solution, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and see if you can find it or create a solution. And then he said, if the rest of the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't be limited by conventional wisdom. He said, this is how science goes forward. So that I had no idea what I was going to do, but that was there in the back of my head. And I will never forget the day. It was August 1977. Someone handed me a book that was my epiphany that changed my life. And it was a book written by Alexander Luria, and I dedicate my book to him because he really saved my life. And it was called The Man with the Shattered World. And it told the story of a Russian soldier, Leo Vysotsky, who at the Battle of Smolensk in Russia in, I think, 1943, had a very localized head wound, right, a shrapnel in his brain. And this book was, Luria, who was a brilliant Russian neuropsychologist, was describing what was going on in Luria's, or in Vysotsky's brain as a result of the injury. And at the same time, Vysotsky was keeping a journal describing his experiences and his challenges. And as I read Vysotsky's journal, I thought, oh my gosh, like, we're having the same experience. I was keeping a journal. We were using the same descriptors, like talking about living in a fog where meaning was ephemeral. It would disappear into a mist. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't grasp and understand things. He, before his injury, he could tell time, like read an analog clock. After his injury, he couldn't. I was now, I think, 26 years old. I still couldn't tell time. I still could not read an analog clock because you have to be able to see the relationship between an hour hand and a minute hand. My brain didn't see relationships. Before the injuries, Vysotsky was gifted. He was studying mathematics. After it, he couldn't understand things as simple as fractions, right? Because it's a relationship, a part to a whole, all sorts of similar experiences. So now I knew what my problem was. I mean, before I knew I had a problem, but to solve a problem, you kind of have to understand the nature or the address of that problem. So now I realized, oh my gosh, it's something in my brain that isn't working.
I just want to interject here. First off, the realization that with all of the challenges that you had, you still went to frickin' university. Now that I mean, that blows my mind just hearing that. I mean, like, I'm going, like, so that resilience, that tenacity is pretty cool. What did you go to university? What was your intention in university? What were you going to be when you grow up, kind of thing?
Well, I first went to study nutrition. My mother was a nutritionist, right? Actually, she was, I think, the provincial nutritionist in British Columbia many, many years ago during the war. But all the sciences killed me, right? So in my first semester, after my first semester, I mean, I managed to pass everything. I realized this probably is not my path. And I'd always been interested in, how people learned because of my difficulties. So I then switched into child studies. And really, I think a lot of my education was trying to understand, like, what was not right with me if I could understand how people learn. So I did child studies as an undergraduate. And then my master's degree was in school psychology. Again, it kind of made sense because that's where you learn how to assess and identify learning difficulties and other difficulties as well. So it just kind of feels like my whole schooling was part of that hunt for what's wrong with me and what do I do about it. So sometimes I think, when they say, if there's a problem on the airline, the lights are going to guide you to safety. Well, I feel like, those lights were on throughout my life, and it was probably my parents, guiding me in this direction, but at an incredible cost. I mean, my whole world was constantly working just to tread water. And before I got Luria's book handed to me, I was going to all my professors in graduate school, and these are the people that are training psychologists to do assessments. And I said, I think I have a learning difficulty, right, or disability. And they kept saying, well, you cannot be in university and have a learning disability. Well, now we know that's not true. You can be gifted and have a learning disability. But they didn't have that concept. This, was in obviously 1977. So it just felt like, there's another door slammed in my face. So it was really Luria that gave me that that insight that this was what my problem was. And then at the same time, I was reading some of Rosenzweig's work. He was the psychologist at Berkeley in California that was looking at this idea of neuroplasticity with rats. And what he found was if, you put rats in a really enriched environment with lots of stimulation and toys to play with, and you compare them to rats in whatever a normal rat environment is and an impoverished environment with not much to do, the rats that had the enrichment were better at learning mazes, which is like an intelligence test for a rat. And then when he looked at their brains afterwards, he found they changed physiologically, like they had more dendrites, so more branches, that led to more synaptic connections, so better neurotransmission, more neurotransmitters, more glia cells. So what he argued was this enriched stimulation led to physiological and functional changes in the brains of the rats, which led to better learning. Then he did an experiment where the light bulbs went off. He blindfolded a group of rats and he put them in a very tactile environment. And he saw the part of the brain related to sensory perception was what changed. So this one little sentence in his article, he said, differential stimulation leads to differential effect. So I thought, oh my gosh, if I can understand what my problem is, like from Luria's work, could I find differential stimulation? Could I find an activity or task that would just work that part of the brain to change it? So I started again. I went back to my professors and said, hey, I'm really excited. I think I've found a solution here. And first they said to me, well, learning difficulties have nothing to do with the brain. That was the belief at that time. I'm not sure where they thought they lived, but It wasn't the brain. Yeah. And then they said, and even if they did, your brain's fixed, so there's nothing you can do about it. But I figured if rats have neuroplasticity, surely humans must. And then I remembered what my father said. He said, people say you can't do it. He said, don't listen, go out and try. So I figured, what do I have to lose but time? And I couldn't tell time.
But that had to be, you had to get pretty lit up about that because, where at some point you were probably feeling pretty hopeless, all of a sudden you can be hopeful because this light has gone on, this door is opened a crack to say, hold it, I may be onto something here. And all of a sudden, there's no doubt when people have hope, then you can also be helped, right? Or you can help, they go hand in hand. When you're hopeless, it's pretty, when you're feeling hopeless, you're pretty difficult to help. That's always the case, right? So that must have been quite an awakening for you at that point, something to get pretty fired up about.
It was. That's why I dedicate my book to Luria. I believe I owe him a life debt because I was intending to end my life at that point, right? Mm-hmm. To your point, I saw no future for myself. I had no hope. I hit a wall in terms of what I could do. And in fact, I didn't finish my master's degree at that point. I took a break, worked on those areas, and then went back in and was able, because of the changes, finish my master's degree. But yeah, I saw no future. Nobody was ever going to hire me, and because of all my struggles, and I didn't understand things. If I was in a job and somebody asked me to do something and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do, they weren't going to give me a couple of hours to figure it out. So, huge despair. Huge despair. So that's why it was just getting that book handed to me. And it was interesting. It was right around the time Luria died. He died, I think in that month in Russia. So that's one of my regrets, that I never had an opportunity to meet him. I've met a few of his students now that are, around my age or older. And it's been wonderful, who also became, followers of his work and psychologists and professors. And, I owe him a life debt.
That's such a great, and I don't want to go there right now, but I'm also I can almost feel what, the degree of being hopeless or frustration or angst and anxiety around what you were going through at that time. You get this light goes on, this door opens a crack or whatever it might be. So you have the realization, well, if a rat brain can do it, I must be able to do something with the human brain. So what was kind of your journey? Where did you start to play and experiment with what would work with you? What was your kind of next steps around that?
Yeah, so I dove back into several of Lauria's books that have been translated into English. And in each of them, as he described this difficulty in this part of the brain, he talked about, the person not being able to tell time. Obviously, multiple other things, like you couldn't connect things, so you couldn't see relationships. So I thought, okay, how do I force my brain to process relationships? Because that's what I needed to do. Like I didn't need to, I couldn't. It's not like teaching a skill or teaching content. I had to change the fundamental functioning of my brain to be able to do what it should be able to do. So I thought, okay, maybe clocks, maybe, forcing myself to learn how to tell time might kind of like be weightlifting for that part of the brain in essence. So the idea is, find the function of that part of the brain and then what kind of task or activity will drive that function. And again, I had no idea if it would work. And at that point, I needed help because I couldn't tell time. So at one point I had this idea of, I think I had 3 watches on my wrist, all set to different times. And I think one was digital because digital was just coming out at that time. And then I look at it quickly and see, can I read it? Right. Well, didn't really do anything other than it was really heavy on my wrist and caused like wrist pain. But then I thought, okay, maybe I have to draw clocks, right, and start to tell time. So it was this kind of iterative process with the hypothesis that, I need to force my brain to process relationships. So, and I was determined. So I did like hundreds and hundreds of hours. Like, I don't know how many clocks did I draw those faces and then read the times. And then I got a random number generator. So I wasn't just, memorizing them because that was always a worry with me because I had the good visual memory and I just mix them and shuffle them and have like 100 clock faces that I had to read really quickly. And over time, I actually started to be able to read a 2-handed clock really fast and really accurately, like sort of to do 25 clock readings in 40 seconds or less. And that was great. Now I could look at a clock and tell time, but I didn't feel like my brain was changing. So the idea that you have to make it more complex, like add cognitive complexity. So I added a 3rd hand, like a 2nd hand, got really fast at that. That was great, but no change. So I said, okay, I have to add a 4th hand. And I mean, they don't exist in the world, but the idea was to force my brain to process 4 relationships simultaneously. So, it was hour, hand, minute hand, second hand, part of a second. And that's where I got my breakthrough. After I got as fast as it was humanly possible and as accurate, so I was 90 to 100% accurate, my world changed and I knew there was human neuroplasticity. Because before, with the best will in the world and putting huge effort, there were things, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do, like understanding. Now I could understand. Like it was I felt like I was walking on air. I could listen to a conversation and I could actually understand it as the person was talking. I could actually say something. Yeah,
But that's an interesting point that you're making there. So first off, I want to go back just for kind of scope of the challenges. And you talk about relatability and not being able to read a clock or not being able to read. But when it came to, let's say, I don't know, tying a pair of shoes, relatedness, this part of the lace over that part of the lace and wrap it around. Were those kinds of mechanical things also a challenge for you at the time? Does it make sense for a button to go through a buttonhole, for example? Were those kind of, or did that just come because you remembered it, or was there relatedness to it?
Yeah, those kind of things just kind of came because I could do some of those like physically. But as soon as it was, my aunt, I just couldn't understand, like, how could my aunt be my aunt and be my mother's sister?
Got
it.
It.
It's kind of obvious. Like it's those conceptual relationships. Like how could she have how could she be like 2 people?
Understood.
It's oh my gosh. Like when I think about it, that mammals have mammary glands. Like that was like a light bulb went off when I realized the connection. Like so, I memorized things, but there was no depth. Like there was no, it was all surface.
Okay, so that level of clarity is helpful. So thank you. So now you go and you learn how to tell time. Now your brain's firing differently, but you're also seeing, I don't know, do we call it a ripple effect? Do we call it because other things came out of that? All of a sudden, you were understanding other things. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah.
Is that so? And all you did was learn how to read time, fire the brain a little different, open up a pathway, and
well, what I believe it is I was stimulating the function of that part of the brain that wasn't working for me. So I don't believe I was working around or going a different way. I was actually laser focused, targeted into that area and doing mental weightlifting for that area. So it could now do what it was designed to do. Right. Before, I'm trying to think of an analogy, like if it just didn't have the strength to be able to do certain things, it didn't matter, how much you tried to compensate or work around it, just wasn't there. Now, because of the exercise and the activity, I'd built muscle in that, or strength, and it could just do what it was supposed to do, right? It just happened naturally. Like, it wasn't like I had to go to study to be able to understand conversations. I could understand, like before, if I read a page in a book, unless it was like Nancy Drew or something really simple, I would read that page like 10, 20 times to try to think, okay, what is this saying? And one of the things that Luria said in one of his books, where I felt, okay, I'm not crazy, because it explained my experience. He said, somebody with the difficulty I had can never verify meaning. So he said, that person is constantly walking around in a state of uncertainty, and the ground is constantly shifting under their feet. So there's never any uncertainty. And that was my experience. Like I was, I joke that I lived in amygdala hell. Like I was terrified all the time because I could just never understand. There was no certainty in my world. Like, I just never understood anything, or, why somebody did something, or why this happened. Like, another descriptor I had for myself was like, I was a puppet, and there was a puppet master somewhere pulling strings, but I had no locus of control, no feeling that I had control over my world, because I didn't understand why things happened. And one of the profound impacts of this work that I never anticipated was, as I got the change, every night as I was sort of drifting off to sleep, because I have that strong visual memory, scenes would play over in my mind's eye from age 4 or 5 or 6. And I say, oh my gosh, like that's why this happened. That's why this person did something. And it felt like that really fractured sense of myself started to integrate into a healthy and whole person. It was like all these puzzle pieces started to come together, and I understood, my world. I started to understand myself. Like I had no insight, and I've seen people that I've worked with that go to therapists to get support, for this kind of confusion or uncertainty, and they can't benefit from therapy because they don't have insight, right? Like can't make those connections. And sometimes then the therapist will say, well, you're just not trying, you're resisting. Well, it's not resistance. Their brain isn't capable of doing that. And that's, I don't know if you know Norman Doidge's work, The Brain That Changes Itself, the research psychiatrist who's here in Toronto. And he got interested in my work because he saw some of his clients in the psychiatric practice that he felt their challenges were cognitive, not emotional. And so he would refer them to me. And as they worked through that same exercise, they could actually benefit from insight therapy. I mean, our brain is incredibly profound.
Well, and even as you're describing it, there's things that show up for me. And I mean, it must have been such a huge light that went on for you. And I mean, as you talked about reflecting and having these pictures go through your mind and connecting the dots of, when you were much younger. I mean, at some point, you're also being socially shut down. Like, you're not interacting with people so much because you've got this secret. You can't understand what they're saying. So then all of a sudden, this opens up a whole new avenue of conversation and discussion with people. Now, when you were talking about the work you were doing around, learning how to tell time, were you being supported by other students, professor, friends, family, or were you just really taking this on your own and working through it for yourself?
Yeah, it was on my own and by myself. I mean, I had to have somebody at the very beginnings, a friend, help me kind of initially tell time, like, sort of to really more check and correct, my mistakes, as it were. But then as I got more capable, I didn't need that support. No, it was just, I did it on my own.
You just figured it out on your own. That's just amazing. I just love that. I mean, that's such a great story, but it also speaks to your journey and your tenacity in doing what you're doing today. But so let's go back there. So you've learned to tell time, lights on, things are going. Now, what else are you learning about that? Because now you've learned to tell time. You say, okay, well, we can fire the brain differently. We can connect synapses in the brain to to think differently, but it also opens up other doors. It opens up other windows of things to look through and see life and understand things differently. And then, so did you start at that point to develop other exercises, and you were kind of your own guinea pig for this stuff, or?
Yes. In essence, because I had multiple areas of difficulty. So
Sure.
that was the one that to me was causing me the most angst. So I targeted that first, but then that part that where I just didn't know where my body was in space, and that was challenging in that I was bruised. Like I go to walk through a door and I might wham myself on the side of the door jamb because I'd misjudge. I had lots of bruises. I've got a tooth that I lost because I went off the wrong end of a diving board. I once slammed a car door on my head. It was like this whole left side of my body was like an alien being. It would just do things that weren't necessarily in my best interest. And then imagine driving a car. So if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, when I got into that car, I didn't know where the left side of that car was. So I was really careful. Like I promise you, I didn't hit anybody, but I hit some poles, in parking.
But how did you know? Just sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting that you talk about that. Was there a time where you actually thought that part was a physical disability, or did you always think it was? I don't know. What did you think? What did you actually think it was a physical disability?
I just thought I was clumsy, or a klutz, right?
Yeah.
How we have those
Sure.
lovely labels, like that just just keep me away from sharp objects because I could cut myself, right?
Don't slice the tomato.
Yeah. I worked with a butcher that had that problem, and the first day I met him, his left arm was all wrapped up in bandages, right? Because he didn't know where the left side of his body was in space. I mean, it's funny, but it was rather painful.
Yeah.
So I just describe myself as clumsy, not athletically inclined. But as I was starting to understand Luria's work, I realized and Rosenzweig, that sensory part of the brain, the somatosensory cortex, thought like maybe that's where the problem is. So I went back in, thought, okay, let me see if I can create an exercise for that. So I did, and now like I don't dent my body, I don't dent my car. I can actually play sports. And before that, it was almost at a level of a stroke. Like I could not, if I picked up a coffee cup in my left hand, I would end up wearing it. The person next to me would end up wearing it because I couldn't regulate the sensory feedback of my movement. So I would over or under move. Like, so that coffee cup could just go right over my shoulder. That doesn't happen anymore, right? So I'll never be a gifted athlete, but I can actually hold my own, athletically, and I don't bang myself or bruise myself. So again, here was another example that a very different exercise, that differential stimulation, you identify the function, find an activity you think will work that function, and see if you can change it, And then I had a spatial problem, the third problem I went on to tackle, and that's where I couldn't conceptualize three-dimensional space in my head. So if you put something in a drawer, like for me, it didn't exist anymore, right? Like, how if somebody's really good spatially, they can kind of visualize their way into three-dimensional space. They can do things like chess or checkers, like, things with three-dimensional elements, geometry, where you have the spatial, angles and relationships, maps. It's a way to tell if somebody has a little bit of a problem here. I mean, not that we use maps anymore because we've got, GPSs, but the person has to turn the map in the direction that they're going.
Mm-hmm.
Because they can't do that mental rotation. I was really, really poor at that, and as growing up, I had this concept that I had to add lost time into everything I was going to do if I was going to go somewhere. I always added an extra hour because I knew I would get lost multiple times before I found my way anywhere. Because I just couldn't understand maps. I couldn't understand like how streets connected. So I created an exercise for that. And now, I travel all around the world, and actually I prefer maps to GPSs because I like to see the spatial patterns. I can build IKEA furniture. Like before, I couldn't go from two-dimensional representation into constructing something in three dimensions. Sewing, if I was sewing from a pattern, I would sew things backwards or upside down, because again, is that spatial translation from two dimensions into three dimensions. An engineer has to be good in that capacity. A dentist has to be very good in that capacity, because you want them to go from the X-ray and map it onto, the tooth and drill the right tooth. So I saw changes in three very different discrete areas as a result of three very different exercises that I created for myself. And at that point, I thought, I want to take this work out into the world and help other people that have similar difficulties to me, and then also different difficulties. And that's where my work began back in 1978.
So you've got this moment of hope. You start to do this work, and you're figuring out that I can rewire my brain. I mean, that's ultimately what you're doing. You're saying you've somewhere along the line, the light bulb's gone on. I can rewire my brain, and it's working. Now, in this process of development and discovering and all the things that you're doing, is this a process of months or years? So when you started learning the clocks, that takes a period of time. Is there this many years later, is there an understanding of how long it takes to refire a brain? Or rewire a brain, if that's the right terminology to use? What were you discovering at that time?
Yeah, well, it's very individual is what I've discovered since then. And some things move more quickly than others. For the first one that I worked on, that reasoning piece, it was probably, I started to see change, and that's not unusual, around like 2 to 3 months, right? And then I wanted more. So I kept going to, like, you can not only, in a lot of cases, bring something from, a deficit or a difficulty to average functioning. But if you can bring it to above average, to put a strength where there was a difficulty, that is really positive. So, so I kept going, and I actually even have levels now that I've never done, right? So I love it when I go out to schools and see students doing it. I say, actually, you're ahead of me on that exercise, because I invented that level, but I haven't done that. So, it is variable. So for me, it was probably over about a year span, of creating these exercises.
That's pretty. I mean, a lifetime of challenges, and over over the course of 12 months, you're able to do that level of work. I mean, I think that's pretty cool. That happened pretty quick. I mean, you're also pretty committed to it, right?
Yes, I don't not
full time.
Yes, I did. I get up in the morning, have breakfast, do the work, have lunch, do the work, have dinner, do the work, go to bed, repeat. And not everybody wants to do it in that way, but we have all sorts of different options, for students.
Have you ever looked at that? Because I want to talk about your schools and your book and all the rest of it. But as you reflect back on that, Barbara, where did that commitment, do you think, live? Because you make an interesting kind of point that I picked up on a little bit, which was, there had to be a huge commitment to yourself. I mean, at some point, you just were so determined to be more. And was that because was there some place where you were comparing yourself to others? Like, any sense of where that drive came from?
Well, I think probably a number of places. I think in my family, I come from, a pretty driven family. Sure. The expectation is we were all going to university. Like, it just wasn't even spoken. It was just a fact.
That's what you're doing.
Yeah. So that was, in the kind of family DNA. And then, certainly seeing both of my parents, worked pretty hard and intensely. So I had that model. And I think also that prefrontal cortex, like the executive functioning, that is really the drive in our brain. Like that's what keeps us goal-oriented, focused, not distracted. If, the butterfly flies out there, you might for a moment, but you come back to, okay, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. And sort of that feedback loop of, okay, this isn't working, so I get rid of that and I bring this in. That was a real strength for me. And I'm sure I inherited that from both of my parents, because looking back, they were very, very strong there. And then the desperation, like, at a certain point, to me, it was either I do this or I have no future and I'm not going to be here, right? So it was sort of all came to a head at that point in August of 1977, where I was incredibly desperate, and I figured, I have no idea if this is going to work, and I have to try, because there is no other future. I mean, I'd done all the compensations that, people do with learning difficulties all the way through my schooling. I learned how to color code. Like I would draw pictures because I would use my right hemisphere to try to map pictures onto language to see if I could understand language. I mean, even when I started reading Luria's books, like, they've got pictures in them. I color coded, notes, vectors, so I had either learned those or created them for myself, and it got me a certain distance, but I knew there was no more distance I could go. Like I was done. I was done at that point. And, as I said, I compromised my immune system. I was getting ill all the time, like physically. And there's certainly research now to show if someone has a learning difficulty, they're more likely to have physical, health related issues. There was a huge study done a number of years ago here in Canada, putting a Canadian face on learning disabilities. And it's one of the most brilliant studies that looks at all sorts of factors related, like emotional factors, social factors, economic factors, and physical factors that are related to having a learning difficulty. And I believe it's, the stress hormone cortisol is not really your friend if you have way too much of it. And when you have a learning difficulty, you can't escape it. I mean, your brain kind of goes with you everywhere you go. So it's just there. And so it was that unremitting stress all the time that, did a number on my immune system, right? So so I was desperate.
So, you're getting these things figured out. You're coming out of university. You're somewhere in late 20s, 30-ish kind of thing when you're starting to go along. And by the sounds of it, I'm in my brain on the timelines anyways. But then you're saying more people need to know about this.
Yes.
And had you recognized at that time, because, I mean, there's certainly not internet as so much back then, maybe some early stuff, but where were you seeing the gap, or how would you identify that, more people need to this? Did you just assume that there's a whole bunch of people like you, or what was your thought process back then?
Yeah, well, again, because I was studying school psychology, part of that was doing assessments to identify learning difficulties. So I saw students in the clinic, at the University of Toronto that I was working at as part of my graduate studies, and I also had a tutoring clinic, right? That to make some income, while I was going through school, and not everybody that came to that tutoring clinic had a learning difficulty, but certainly some did, right? And again, it was using all the compensations and workarounds. And when I saw the change for myself, I thought this is so much better than putting energy into compensating and working around. Actually, you address and strengthen the weak capacity, which then you don't have to do the workarounds and compensations. So I had those experiences of seeing those students. And then not too long after that, I met someone who was working at I think it's the YMCA in their vocational counseling department, right? So, so he was seeing a lot of individuals, 18, 19, that had finished high school, right? But we're kind of looking at, where do I go next? And, some of them it was really clear, but he saw a group where, they were bright, but there were areas when he did his vocational assessment that looked like maybe learning difficulties, right? So, and he became aware of my work. So he started referring some of these individuals to me, and it was fascinating. It was like a naturalistic experiment, right? So they would come through the door. I would create little tests. I would go back into Luria's work. I'd listen very deeply because they didn't all have the same difficulties that I had. I mean, some had memory problems. And then I would try to think, okay, based on what they're telling me, maybe it's this problem. I go back and, create some more little, assessments. And over time, that's how the work evolved. And sometimes things ended up in the garbage pail, right? Which is, as you're developing something or, in science, there are definitely failures, right? That it didn't do what I thought it would do. But over time, I developed a range of programs for 19 different cognitive functions. And I'm clear that's not everything that can go wrong with learning, but it's a really broad base. And now we, train teachers all around the world to deliver this program for students as young as, 5. And we've worked with people up into their 80s.
So tell me a little bit about, why don't we talk about Arrowsmith program, because you've gone through that, you've developed that. And, I really get that must have been just such an exciting time for you. And I'm sure that there has to have been part of your inspiration to continue even with that body of work was, you were getting results with your students, with kids you're working with. That has to be pretty fulfilling just in itself, seeing these changes and that the work that you were doing is going to make a difference in other people's lives. How ideal is that? It's what I love about RAIN and what we do, right? We get to live into supporting other people's success and learning and all the things they do. It's a pretty ideal way of operating for us, especially if you want to be a contribution to others. So at that time, aside from the science of it, which the intellect I'm sure is what drove it too. You had to be sensing that you're making a pretty big difference in people's lives. Would that be the case?
Yeah, it was huge, right? I saw the difference in my life, and then I wanted to offer that to other people. Profound. Just, things that maybe are really simple. I remember one student coming through the door, and she had significant auditory memory problems. And she was just so happy, and I asked her, what had happened. And that morning she was listening to the radio and she was able to remember the phone number. It was a dial-in contest, which she never would have been able to remember before. And, she managed to get through. And then there was a skill testing question that they asked, and she understood it and was able to answer it. And she won the radio contest. So, to me, it's the real life, changes that are so profound. And sometimes people ask, am I happy or satisfied with what I've done? And I think the answer will be never will I be, right? Because there's always another horizon. There's always another, person out there that's struggling. It's like, I don't know if you know Rainer Marie Rilke, who wrote one of his poems, The Swan, Der Schwan, right? And it talks about lumbering through that which is not done. I feel like my life is lumbering through that which is not done. It's always the next, the next possibility. So that's just how I'm wired. But to see the transformation and the possibilities that these individuals have, no matter what age. And we're now working out actually in Vancouver. There's an organization called ABI Wellness, so Acquired Brain Injury Wellness, and they've taken some of my work and they're applying it to people with chronic brain injury. And it is fascinating. We're seeing the same results because we're doing imaging research at the University of British Columbia. We've done it both with students with learning difficulties and with this group with acquired brain injury, and seeing very similar kinds of changes, right? It's profound. It's transformative, where these people would have been marginalized that now can go out and engage in the world. And that's, we've got a huge research initiative going with researchers at Southern Illinois University in the States, UBC. We've done some research at University of Calgary. We're doing research at a university in Madrid. Earlier this week, I spoke to researchers in Geneva and Switzerland that are interested in doing work. So we're now actually imaging the brain. So 40 plus years ago, I hypothesized, based on Luria's work and Rosenzweig's work, that this work was changing the brain, which was what needed to be changed to allow all the learning to go forward. And now we're actually seeing in the imaging that, yes, the brain of students going through this program is changing. So technology's opened up a whole new door to the body of work that you're doing. It's fantastic. Let's go back and, so you start to develop the programs. Where did the whole idea of Arrowsmith schools and come from? Because one thing to have a program, it's another to, go on this business entrepreneurial journey called, okay, well, let's take this to a whole new level and build schools, or not build them, but open schools and do your thing. How did that start to kind of come to life, Barbara? Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If anybody had told me I was going to be an entrepreneur, I would have said, you're crazy.
That's not
in my makeup. But, so I was still working in this tutoring clinic, right? So these were students that were coming to me after school that were spending the day in school struggling and having to put in extra effort. And then to do this work, they were having to also come after school when they were exhausted and do the work that I developed. And I thought, doesn't make sense, right? So what is a student's job is to spend the day in school. So why don't I open a school? So that was 40 years ago. Actually, it's our 40th anniversary for Arrowsmith School in Toronto. So September of 1980, opened a school so that the students could actually do this work, as part of their regular curriculum. And so that's where it started. It was really because I saw a need for these students, not to be torturing them after school when they were already exhausted. And then I think it was 1996, I thought, it's great. I've got my school in Toronto. I'm helping students, but it's a small number of students. And I thought, how do I take this work out into the world to help more students? And so at that point, I started talking to other educators. And I talked to educators that developed reading programs mainly, because nobody at that time had really developed a cognitive program, just to learn, what was their experience, what worked. And what I kept hearing from these individuals was they felt, they had developed a good program based on good science. They would, train teachers to implement the program maybe in 2 or 3 days. And then basically they would give them the materials and send them out into their classrooms with no follow-up. And what happened over time, because not everything works exactly as designed, so the teachers might start modifying the program. And basically at the end, nobody was happy. The people that developed it weren't happy. The teachers weren't happy because they weren't getting the results. And I thought, I have to build in a big support component of whatever I do if I take this out in the world, to really support the teachers and educate them and do ongoing professional development. So ultimately, we're supporting the end user, who is the student. So that was the growth of my model. And so I started working with a couple schools in Toronto and in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, implementing the program and learning, how to train, how to build support in. And now I think we're in 95 schools in 10 countries. And the idea is, I have 2 schools that I own, one in Toronto and one in Peterborough, but I thought I don't really want to own schools all around the world. So we create partnerships with existing schools where we train the teachers, we provide all the methodology, the assessment, the programs, and do ongoing support and training for the teachers. And now we have a huge database that basically almost down to the student's keystroke is tracked. So I'm I love big data. So we have huge amount of data, and we've built in kind of algorithms and benchmarks. So every single student's progress through the work is tracked. And if we see that somebody is not moving in the way we expect, either going too fast or too slow, then we start a dialogue to try to understand, is there another area that's interfering? What's going on? So we can ensure really, really good delivery. And the favorite part of my work is when I get to go out into the world and visit these classrooms, because all of us have a student number because we track the data. So I'm student 0001. So I was ground zero.
That's awesome. Ground zero.
So I was one of them, right?
Yeah.
And we relate. It does my heart good because, I am them and they are me, right? Mm-hmm. And I learned from them. I mean, it was a student that's still bubbling around in my head that I met in Melbourne, in Australia, in February, that, has triggered an idea of maybe how I can, do something in one of the exercises. So I'm always like a little sponge learning as I go out there, and the students are my greatest teachers. So I love what I do. I mean, sometimes there's a little too much of it.
Sure.
but I love it.
Well, I know. Yeah. I mean, it's, Stephanie and I talk about that often with people, is that, everybody goes, you're so busy, you're always working. I go, well, I don't know. If your work is work, then I guess you're working. But if you love what you do, then it's just what you do. It's just your life, right? So I have a different perspective. Now, it's a fantastic legacy. Barbara, you talk about, the guidance and the wisdom that your dad passed on to you in terms of, if just because the masses don't accept it, or if you see that gap, move through it, look at it and fill that gap. And in the body of work that you're doing, I mean, because it's science, because there's stories about scientists and all the rest of that goes on, politics and the things, were you pretty widely accepted early on in this body of work, or did you have peers that were going, yeah, I don't think so? Like, did you have to fight through that on top of it?
Yes. I mean, I remember, because again, and when I went to my professors in 1977, they said that learning disabilities have nothing to do with the brain, and there is no human neuroplasticity, or if there is, it shuts down at age 10 or 11. So that was the worldview. I mean, it was what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. I mean, the belief was, the brain is pretty fixed, and so if there's a difficulty with it, you learn to live with it. So no, there was huge resistance, huge at the beginning, and lack of support, and actually quite points pretty disheartening smear campaign around my work.
Wow.
But I thought I have two choices here. One choice is I can spend a lot of energy and effort trying to change people's belief systems, or I can spend that energy and effort into developing my work. And I thought, I'm going to spend the time and energy in developing my work. And if there is validity and truth and credibility in what I'm doing, the world will move in that direction. And here we are, all those years later, where, it's like my research on my work is being presented, at the Society for Neuroscience, like July next week. Conference is going to be a virtual conference now because it was supposed to be in Vienna, but the International Neuropsychological Society conference work is it's not, I'm not doing the research, but researchers who are investigating my work are presenting on my work. The group in Madrid were supposed to be presenting at a big conference in Prague in July. I mean, that's on hold now because of COVID. But, it's this, there's a body now of research saying that what I postulated 40 plus years ago actually is true, right? So, I think I took the right approach, not fighting. And I don't believe fighting in that way. It wouldn't have changed people's ideas because it was their belief system.
Sure.
They were educated the brain is fixed. And there's still a few people today that oppose my work. But again, I think we're just going to continue to do the research and show what's happening, for these students, not only in their brains, but as the brain is changing, cognition is changing, and we're demonstrating that on a lot of different measures. Academic performance is changing, social emotional well-being is changing, and one of the researchers actually looked at cortisol, and cortisol is being reduced in students going through the program because stress is less, because now they can engage and understand their world. So, and we've now got research students just in regular classes, so students not identified as learning difficulties, who 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week in their regular grade 3 class are doing one of the cognitive exercises. And we're seeing significant changes. Like if you have a brain, you can enhance it, right? You can stimulate it if you work on the cognitive exercises. So there's huge application for this work.
Within the podcast, I mean, the podcast is, really built around seemingly ordinary individuals who achieve extraordinary results. And you go through what you've gone through, you get tested, you stay true to your, stay true to your path and what you believe and what and the testing that you're doing, and you come out the other side and you face those adversities, which of course, growing up, you were built to face adversity. I mean, it was kind of in front of you. You either do it or you don't, right? And you hit that kind of, dark night of the soul or whatever that might have been for you, and you bust through it. And that's an amazing kind of story. But when you come out the other side, as you hear the difference you've made in the world, the legacy that you're leaving. Tell me a little bit, because there's when we're talking about firing the brain, learning difficulties aside. Okay, I could say I have learning difficulties. I always, to this day, I cannot figure out why I'm so bad at remembering names. Yet I have huge memory in so many other things, like to the point of, like you, I can bring back conversations and almost remember every word of a conversation. Stephanie would argue with me on that point, but it's true. So I can reach back in the recesses of my mind and pull certain things up. So the question is this: based on what you're saying, we can train ourselves to, fire our brain differently, open up those synapses, get, shift our cognitive, what would you say, cognitive capacity, or I don't know what the right terminology would be.
That's it. Okay. Cognitive capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a little trick, there's a tell me something, because I've been told, and so I believe it. I've never researched it. Children who learn to play the piano are generally have better math skills. That I don't know if that's a story, a myth, but you think about the idea of learning to play the piano and all the things, learning to read music, but then actually the physicalness of it. Would a statement like that be probably make sense?
Yes, I mean, because they're stimulating certain aspects of the brain that are related also to certain aspects of numeracy. So yes, I mean, there's certain things that, that work cognitive function, right? Absolutely, yes, there is definitely research looking at that.
My brain is fired. I'm very right. I say that all the time. I'm very right. Which is to say that the right side of my body is so clear, and I'm stronger. I'm all the things, and my left was always uncoordinated and really. But I started working with my left. Like I trained. I would use my left side more. I'd use my left hand more. I would do things left, 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 and it's amazing the difference. I don't know if I'm smarter for it, but I feel more in balance physically because of it. And
Yeah.
I had no measurement. Like I didn't say, okay, well, I wonder if I'll remember names better if I work the left-hand side of my body. But this is just context, right? This is kind of what you're saying is that.
Yeah, I believe there are multiple windows in to stimulate the brain, right? My work is just one aspect or one way to do that. But I mean, I've met people, again, as I travel, that realized they had a difficulty, just like you're describing there, and they created some activity or work to improve that function. So, you created your own cognitive exercise, right? By doing that, there's work, I'm not suggesting either of us were stroke victims, but where, they would, constrict the good side to force the person, it's Edward Taub's work, right? To force the area that was damaged to actually have to start to move. And that stimulated the brain that then, allowed more motor functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think there are lots and lots of ways that people can create their own cognitive exercises to stimulate the brain. I mean, the challenge with some of the, programs that you see out there, because now the brain is a hot topic. What I would say, and stimulation is good, so I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these programs, general stimulation. But if you have a learning difficulty, you need targeted stimulation. Like you do something that's kind of like a scattergun approach, like it's stimulating multiple different areas. It's actually not going to necessarily be of benefit to someone with a learning difficulty because they need something targeted to the area of their difficulty. And the brain is incredibly complex, right? There was just research that came out of Cambridge in this past February, looking at individuals, I think 330 individuals identified as having learning difficulties. And what they said, these diagnostic labels aren't very useful, like dyslexia, dysgraphia. It's actually you have to look at the cognitive functions and its weakness in connectivity, which is what our research, the imaging research is being done on students in Arrowsmith is showing a brain pattern of under connectivity. So the areas where they're weak, they don't have strong connectivity within the networks or between networks. And then the brain is compensated by having areas that hyperconnect, just like, my super duper memory. But those hyperconnected areas are trying to compensate for the weaker areas, but they really can't because they're not designed to do that. So you have a really inefficient brain. And what we're seeing in the research as students are going through Arrowsmith is those underconnected networks are starting to strengthen in their connectivity. We can actually measure that. And as a result, the hyperconnected areas are starting to relax. They aren't having to work as hard. So you get a brain that's much more efficient in processing. And, I've worked with some very creative people, like visually creative, musically creative. And as they go through some of the programs, what they find is their creativity goes on even to another level because it's like energy's freed up in the system that wasn't having to go into kind of compensate for some of the difficulties. And, so all of a sudden now that energy that was going into compensation is freed up to go into creativity.
Have you, based on your data now, Barbara, have you come to a place where you're able to connect dots for students? So in other words, if you're doing some level of test to get a benchmark and you're seeing where those challenges lie, that you can actually, I'm assuming, and I don't want to assume, that you can actually assign, specific activities or tests or training or whatever that would deal with that specific issue? Have you got it that kind of dialed in?
Yes, we do. So anybody that comes into the work, we do a one-day assessment that looks at the 19 functions that we can work on, and it creates a profile and a unique learning profile for that student across those 19 functions on actually a 12-point scale. So the combinations and permutations are pretty wild. And based on their profile, there's kind of a triage that happens. I mean, it used to be happening in my brain, but I realized, I may not be here forever. So I worked with software developers, and it's now I'm being replaced by a computer software program. So now the program will look at that profile and say, for this student, here are the critical areas. Like, something might be severe, but it's not as critical as a mild problem, because that mild area has a broader impact in terms of their functioning. So absolutely, they'll say, okay, for this student, here's what they need to work on, here's where they need to start. And then we track as they move through the program. Like we track hugely, and then at the end of a year, if they're in the program, we do a reassessment, and then based on that assessment, okay, this area is no longer an issue. We can drop it out, and if you want to continue, here's the next area in the sequence. So we have people that come in, to a school like in a full-time program, so they're just working most of the day on cognitive areas. We have part-time programs. We have an intensive program like what I did, where for 6 weeks, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, students are just doing that reasoning exercise, and we're seeing amazing results. We have people flying in all around the world. We now have it in Thailand, in Australia, New Zealand, because not everybody can spend 10 months working on something, and it's about 4 hours per week to affect change. But some people can take a compressed amount of time and work on that area. So to me, I'm always looking at, how can we make this work more accessible? And the benefit of COVID for this work is, those 95 schools all had to close their doors physically around the world. And all of a sudden, how do they keep going in this program? So we'd been doing a lot of development work with Alteryx, the software development company, and within probably 3 weeks, we had pivoted. So every student around the world was able to enter a virtual classroom with their teacher and continue with the work and monitoring. And we've just been getting, feedback. And some students are doing even better in a virtual classroom than in person. And so now, not just in response to COVID, but we're now developing this as a delivery model, so geography will not be a barrier. I mean, somebody could be in Timbuktu and access the program because they don't have to physically be in the school. So I'm really excited. I mean, that was part of my vision. Maybe in 3 years from now, we'd have, Arrowsmith online, but we have Arrowsmith online right now.
Well, that's just, yeah. And Rain was the same way. I mean, we did live events. I mean, we really are an adult education, adult coaching program. I mean, that's what Rain is built on. It happens to be in the world of investing in real estate and teaching people. But along the way comes, personal, professional development, all those things. But ultimately, we were able to pivot very, very quickly into this kind of virtual world. And we're seeing that people actually many are learning better and getting more out of that delivery system than actually these live events where, some people aren't necessarily comfortable in a live scenario, plus the geography, plus the time, plus all the things that come with it. So that's kind of interesting. I had a question for you, and it comes from me because of Stephanie. Stephanie grew up dyslexia, left hand, learned to do right. So, I mean, Stephanie's a really, really bright lady, but I also see where, because we've talked about it, her and I, many times, about how her brain fires because of that, because of growing up that way. So for you, when you look at all the work you've done and your own development, do you see where some of the gifts that you have today, whether it be, memory and, primarily, I think that's part of it, or the way you look at things, do you still rely on it? Do you see that gift you have as a good thing? I did all that work early on. Does it show up that way in how you learn, how you process? Do you still see gaps? How do you observe yourself these days?
It's a really interesting question. I think, those memory pieces are still there. Are they quite as sharp as they were when I had to use them as a compensation? I don't think so, because I don't have to rely on them. I have other things that work now, right? But they're still probably pretty exceptional, but they, and I'm actually quite happy that I don't have to rely on them, and I can actually understand what people say. I'd say for me, it's a really hard question, because some people say, would I have preferred not to have the learning difficulties I had, but they shaped me, right? Like, and incredible pain. I mean, incredible pain growing up. But if I took any of that away, I wouldn't be the person I am now, and I wouldn't have developed this work. So, everything led me, to creating this work. And I think, if I conceptualize or think about what I think this work does, is it opens possibilities for people, right? And a lot of the adults that I work with talk about, when they went to choose their career, several doors were closed to them, right? And now what this work does is it opens more doors and more possibilities. They still might make that same choice, but now it's a choice rather than kind of being forced in a certain direction. And I think, a lot of these students, and again, depending on the degree of the difficulties, it causes suffering. Like it causes suffering and pain. And I think fundamentally this work, it alleviates suffering. And a number of years ago, I remember a group of students, sharing with me that they stopped at a certain point daring to dream. Like they just said, we just basically shut down our dreams because, like me, they didn't see a future for themselves. And that just broke my heart. And so I think what this work does is not only does it allow people to dare to dream, but it gives them the cognitive capacity to actually be able to realize those dreams, right? Because it's one thing to have dreams, but you have to have kind of the wherewithal to be able to do the things to realize them. And that's what these students can do. And I've seen, students 30 years out of the program that come back to me, 20 years out of the program, they still have that increased cognitive ability. Like it's not like a muscle, we stop going to the gym and our muscles atrophy. And I think what happens, even though we use the analogy of a muscle, the brain isn't exactly a muscle. But what happens is once those areas are strengthened, they start to get their own stimulation by working within the neural network on a daily basis, right? Whereas before it was a drag on that network because, the weaker areas were causing the stronger areas to have to work too hard. And now they're all engaged in working in everyday activities and getting their own stimulation. Like we see no drop off of function. Like people don't have to continue to do the exercises. I just every once in a while, think back to, that person I was at 26, seeing no future for myself and the despair. I don't want anybody to have to be in that place. And that's what drives me to do this work is, to allow those individuals to have the capacity to be able to dream and realize their dreams.
Yeah. I even hear that in your language and just, how you show up in this conversation is that there's got to be so much relatedness that you have to your students because of your own journey. I mean, I think that there's got to be a part of you that has so much compassion and empathy and understanding of what people are going through that at some point, in your own growth, through childhood and your parents and really being driven to say, I can make a difference in other people's world and be really attached to that because what people are going through and go, I can make that go away. I can help you. I can help you achieve those dreams. Whether you're saying that directly, but in the back of your mind, there's just got to be a part of you that, has that such strong relatedness and compassion for people. And I think that's pretty powerful. It's very cool.
Absolutely. It's a driving force, beside my computer in my home study. I, have a picture of this young girl. I think she was like 4.5 when she came to me. And, and at that point, I'd never worked with somebody that young, and her parents both, begged me to try. So I had to create simpler exercises, which is what happens with this work. Like it gets driven by who walks through the door. And, and so, her picture there is to remind me, always to grow and to learn and to push boundaries. She's now a medical doctor, and it's just, like rather than saying, no, I've not done this before, how can I do this, right? And how can I benefit this individual, right? So, yeah.
And your journey is, I mean, when you think about your own journey, Barbara, personally, you come from that history. There's wounds that, we all suffer, growing up through all of those things. And, this wasn't, there was also I'm assuming this, although I do know a little bit about a little bit of work you've done, other than, because you and Stephanie knew each other in some past part of what you did, or you still know each other. It's not like you've forgotten about each other. So I'll be a little careful about that. But I mean, ultimately, the point of that story or that comment is that you've done a lot of, and you continue to do, I'm assuming, a lot of just personal, professional development. You've had to heal some wounds. You've had to go through that past, and where you are today is really driven by how the outcome of this. So, are you encouraging people, like, as they're going through your own program, are you sharing stories of your own life? Are you talking to, are you giving people and parents hope through your own experience, your own stories? Is that how that kind of evolves as well, Barbara?
It does. And that was partly writing the book, right? It's not just my story, but my story is woven through, and certainly I get a lot of feedback in my TED Talk as well, that people relate to it, because it's like, I'm just like, I saw myself in Zazetsky. People see themselves in my story and my journey. And I mean, talking about the personal development work, I wouldn't have been able to do it before, when I had the difficulty, because I wouldn't have had insight. And I, was very naive when I started this work. In some senses, I thought, okay, you address the cognitive problem, you rewire the brain, you strengthen those areas, all that emotional stuff's just going to disappear. Like, it's like, a light switch is going to go on.
Well, it'll go away.
Yeah, it'll just go away, because, my world will be different. Well, maybe if I was 5, but, at 26, 27, kind of stuff had been embedded, in my system. And so, I realized I actually need to get some therapeutic support, to help me dismantle, a lot of those patterns that really weren't, very healthy or very constructive. And then I also realized that if I really want to take this work out into the world, it's kind of like physician, heal thyself. Like I needed to do my work to not get in the way of having this work go out into the world. So that also was a huge motivator in terms of, looking at my patterns, which were self-limiting and not conducive to being kind of a vehicle or a vessel for this work. So, yes.
Wow. Well, and that would open up a whole different conversation. Barbara, I know I've taken a lot of your time, and I do so much appreciate this conversation. I find it fascinating, and really, really kind of am blown away by the depth of the story and your journey, and thank you so much for sharing it. So we'll wind down, because I could literally go on like you just like I wanted to talk more about your book and all sorts of things, but maybe we can make this happen again, another part 2 one day down the road. I would look forward to it. As I wind down the podcast, Barbara, we always try and have a little bit of fun and some laughs and a kind of a quick rapid fire questions, and have some fun with it. And then they're only as rapid fire as they are. So, I mean, you talk about the book that kind of changed your life, took you on a whole different path. And of course, you've got the book that you wrote. But what are you reading these days, or what is one of your favorite books to gift?
No, I don't know what gift. I'm a little embarrassed. Like, I love mystery and detective stories, right? So,
yeah. Good. Well, but that's a good point. You read fiction. That's brilliant.
I do. I have this idea of mind candy, right? Because a lot of my reading, for work is really dense. So but I love Camilla Lackberg and the kind of, and Donna Leon. That's her books are set in Venice, kind of a really well written, well crafted mystery or detective story, where I can just actually go to a different country and follow a character through a journey.
I love that too, by the way. I love that type of reading as well. And I don't read a lot of fiction, but when I do, particularly on vacations and stuff, that's what I'll read. I enjoy that kind of stuff as well. I get it. Favorite inspirational quote?
Oh gosh, it's got to be probably something of Brené Brown, like, in her Courage to Lead. Like, I think I don't know a specific quote, but lead through courage and vulnerability. I just learned a Maori word from New Zealand, mana, which is, to me, embraces that, is a whole concept in that word. So maybe mana is my new word. Is like courage and grit and resilience and being open and vulnerable and humble. So any quote that has those concepts in it.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the gates?
Oh gosh, you can rest now.
That's very good. Very good. Favorite tune?
Favorite tune?
Yeah.
Sibelius's Violin Concerto, done by Ida Handel.
Wow, you came to that really quick.
Oh my gosh, it's one of the, and I think she was like 78. I heard her actually perform it. It's just, to me, I love violin music. If I'd ever been able to play an instrument, it would be the violin. And to me, that's one of the most beautiful pieces of music in the world.
I'm going to listen to it. Barbara, what are you grateful for?
Oh, what am I grateful for? I'm grateful for my parents. I'm grateful for my brothers. I'm grateful for my health. And I'm grateful that I'm able to do this work. I'm incredibly grateful for that.
And I'm incredibly grateful to have had you on the show and to have had the honor of having this conversation with you, Barbara. And today, I'm grateful for some amazing weather in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, and that I'm hanging out with my wife a little bit today. So today, that's what I'm grateful for. Barbara, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
It's been an absolute delight and a pleasure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. If you found value in the podcast, please take the time to rate and review and share with others. Share with your friends. As it is my goal to always improve and to provide the highest value for you, the listener. If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions you'd like answered, please email me at ceo@reincanada.com. That's ceo@reincanada.com. I look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, Patrick out.